Although Korea's real estate problems are serious, Europe is facing problems that go far beyond Korea's. In some cases, people have to pay more in rent than they earn in salary. Today, let's take a proper look at this issue. Let's get started. Recently, there was a large-scale protest in Spain against the soaring cost of housing. Currently, large-scale protests against the skyrocketing cost of housing are taking place one after another in European countries. First, let's look at the ratio of rent expenses to income in Europe. According to a survey by Deutsche Bank Research Institute, they investigated the ratio of rent expenses to income in major European cities. But this was really shocking. In Lisbon, Portugal, people had to pay 116% of their income for rent, which means even after getting their salary, they don't have enough money to pay the rent. In Barcelona, Spain, it was 74% Milan, Italy was 72% Dublin, Ireland was 62%, and Athens was 57%. As you can see, it's quite shocking. Traditionally, Germany has had a high rate of home rentals, so Berlin was once called a paradise for tenants. In the early to mid-2000s, thanks to very cheap rent and plenty of available properties, you could find the house you wanted at the price you wanted. Especially after German reunification, there was a construction boom around Berlin, and with an oversupply of housing, prices dropped. However, as time passed, Berlin's population started to increase rapidly. Immigrants from Southern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa flocked to Berlin, and now you have to spend about 40% of your monthly salary just to cover rent. But there's another serious problem here. The housing crisis in Europe is no longer just an issue for low-income people. In the past, it was mainly low-income groups who felt the burden of housing costs, but now even the middle class with stable jobs is being affected. This phenomenon is spreading rapidly, especially in major cities. In the case of Berlin, Germany, even full-time employees are finding it difficult to find a house in the area they want. This is why people say that having an income no longer guarantees you can solve your housing problems. Many households are lowering their standard of living to handle rent increases that outpace their income. People are eating out less, canceling trips, and delaying big purchases like cars and appliances. The burden is growing, especially for dual-income families. In the past, when two people worked together, buying a home was a realistic option, but now the situation has changed. With rising housing prices and loan burdens, many families are abandoning the idea of home ownership. Even with a stable job, there's a growing perception that it's hard to keep up with the rising home prices. The problem is, this phenomenon doesn't just affect individuals' lives. The middle class is key to consumption in most countries, but if rising housing costs make them spend less, the overall economy will likely slow down. For companies, sales of goods and services are bound to decrease, which can lead to reduced investment and job cuts. In fact, European economic experts warn that if the current housing crisis continues for a long time, it could become a factor that slows down economic growth itself, going beyond just a real estate problem. If housing costs are too high, consumption drops, which also reduces business activity. If tax revenues fall and welfare burdens rise, government financial pressure could increase. Because of this, there are growing voices in Europe saying that the housing crisis should be seen not just as a social issue, but as an economic one as well. There are concerns that if the current situation continues, the group that will be hit the hardest could actually be the middle class, which has supported the national economy. In Spain, as I mentioned earlier, the two major labor unions have joined forces to protest, showing just how strong the backlash is. The Madrid Tenants Union claims that the real estate market, which is focused solely on rental profits, is pushing thousands of households into economic crisis. And in Spain, the number of foreign tourists alone reached 97 million in 2025, setting a new all-time high. At this time, the demand for tourism is actually worsening the housing crisis, and with the influx of immigrants and speculative real estate purchases by wealthy people from Central and South America, there is a side effect of pushing local residents out of the city center. According to Eurostat, the current EU statistical agency, there is a shortage of 700,000 homes. As a result, dissatisfaction among young people is growing day by day across Europe. Looking at Spain as an example, the Spanish Youth Council reports young people's average monthly post-tax salary is 1,190 euros, or about 2.09 million won. However, it has been found that the average monthly rent is 1,176 euros, which is about 2.06 million won. That means 98.7% of their salary goes to rent. In fact, it's almost like telling them not to live in places like Madrid or Barcelona. The Equal Welfare Alliance, a group of social welfare organizations, said Germany's poverty rate is now at a record high. In a report on June 2, the Equal Welfare Alliance, a coalition of social welfare organizations, stated that in 2025, 13.3 million people, or 16.1% of the total population, were classified as living in poverty. The poverty rate rose by 0.6 percentage points compared to 2024, marking the highest level since records began. The report explained that although the poverty rate had decreased from 2020 to 2023, the trend has now reversed. The main reason given is that people couldn't afford living costs, particularly higher housing costs, heating, and utility bills. As housing costs continue to rise, the groups most directly affected can be divided into two main categories. There are young people preparing to live independently and elderly relying on fixed incomes after retirement. In particular, it's no exaggeration to say that the dissatisfaction among young people has been changing the entire political landscape of Europe in recent years. Many young people work hard but can't find a place to live and spend most of their salary on rent, leading them to search for the causes of the housing crisis. In this process, the first group to be singled out were immigrants. In fact, in Germany and the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, Spain, and other countries have experienced a significant increase in immigrants and refugees in recent years. With the large-scale movement of refugees following the war in Ukraine, some areas have experienced a sharp increase in housing demand. So, many citizens tend to associate the housing difficulties they experience with the increase in immigration, but experts' analyses are a bit different. This is because the reasons for rising housing prices in Europe vary significantly from country to country. In some countries, the expansion of the tourism industry has had a decisive impact, while in others, a prolonged shortage of supply is considered the main reason. Other countries attribute the housing crisis mainly to foreign real estate purchases and the after effects of low interest rate policies, so it's hard to blame Europe's current crisis solely on immigration. Of course, we can't say that immigration hasn't had any impact. Nevertheless, the situation is unfolding differently in the political sphere. As economic uncertainty grows, people tend to blame whoever is most visible for problems rather than the complex underlying reasons. In some countries, more people are blaming housing shortages, rising rent, and strained public services on immigration policy failures. This mood is also impacting election outcomes. Recently, parties across Europe that push for stricter immigration and border controls are gaining increased support. They are making the housing shortage a key political focus and stressing policies that put their citizens first. As some young people unable to find housing sympathize with these arguments, support for anti-immigration parties is gradually growing. This is exactly what European politicians are most concerned about right now. Dissatisfaction that started with housing issues is leading to social conflict, which is then expanding into political confrontation. Now that things have reached this stage, governments can no longer remain inactive. The Spanish government especially sees housing as a social issue tied to young people's livelihoods, and has chosen to invest significant funds. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced a plan to invest about 7 billion euros, or roughly 11 trillion won over the next 4 years to expand public housing supply and support young people with renting and purchasing homes. The plan is to increase new housing construction, especially in areas suffering from severe housing shortages, and to lower the barriers for young generations to enter the housing market. Locally, there are concerns that these measures will take a long time to have a real effect. Public housing cannot be supplied immediately just by making plans. It has to go through land acquisition, permits, and construction processes. This situation is not unique to Spain. As the housing crisis spread in Europe, the EU intervened directly for the first time, announcing a continent-wide legal plan for housing supply. The key point is to invest 153 billion euros, which is about 269 trillion won, to promote the supply of 2.25 million new homes every year. If you include various financial support and additional investment plans, the total scale is expected to be even larger. The plan also aims to simplify complex administrative procedures and relax state aid rules, enabling member states to participate more in housing projects. Housing policy is primarily the responsibility of each member state. Nevertheless, the reason the EU has stepped forward is because it has determined that the current housing crisis is not just a real estate market issue, but is also shaking the labor market, economic growth, social integration, and even political stability. High housing costs are delaying young people's independence, lowering the birth rate, and making it hard for companies to find workers. On top of this, as citizens struggling with the cost of living become more dissatisfied, distrust toward the existing political establishment is also growing. The leadership is mainly worried about the political backlash. Growing dissatisfaction with housing issues increases support for far-right parties that promote anti-immigrant views or criticize the system. Recently, several European countries have seen rising approval for right-wing parties. Against this backdrop, the EU is viewing the expansion of housing supply not just as an economic policy issue, but as a task for maintaining social stability and political order, and is raising its level of response. This is similar to what the United States is doing.